Part 12. Entropy and Rebellion. Dogmatic Revolution. On the face of it, iconoclasm appears to be an intellectual form of rebellion, a destructive force which takes the preconceived and crushes it under the weight of its own presumption. The iconoclast, however, lacks conviction. It is conviction which creates law. Conviction institutes a boundary point, the intraversible line which cognitively provides a foundation for the productive activity. The iconoclast doesn't have no in their lexicon. The convicted dogmatist requires their no in order to institute the converse ideal of their yes. In The Rebel, Camus observes a similarly counterintuitive state of affairs in relation to revolution. Revolution is the fight for something against something, the against being the no of the other, the anti-ideal, the deontological boundary which sparks the need for rebellion. No affirms the existence of a borderline. The destructive nature of the iconoclast resides in the fact that they are anti-preservation. The iconoclastic impulse sees nothing intrinsically worth keeping on the intellectual landscape and instigates a cleansing deluge of destructive cognitive praxis which wipes the state clean. Iconoclasm is a totalitarianism of nothing. The dogmatist, despite their tendency to blind myopia, at least sees the need to rebel against the oppression of a metaphysical whatever. Why rebel if there's nothing worth preserving in oneself? The truth is that we are all slaves and prisoners to this metaphysical whatever we find ourselves wandering. Reality places us under the boot of an arbitrary origin and the inaccessible ultimate of metaphysics. This beginning, middle, and end possesses a force majeure over all our triumphs and dreams. The opaque nature of the metaphysical reality places us in a perpetual state of chaos, which, like an excess of order, is also a form of servitude. Embracing a dogmatic opinion on the question of metaphysics is, in a way, rebellion against this chaos of whatever. By stepping into opinionated speculation, the dogmatist goes beyond their purview of knowledge and instigates a microcosm of their own creation. This is a rebellious interpretation of the sub-questions dogmatic thinking creates. Freedom, particularly when it is a prisoner's dream, cannot endure limitations. It must embrace crime, or it is no longer freedom. Crime is a necessity for liberation and freedom. What is called law having no direct correlation with virtue. Demonstrably, we must know that justification of following orders can be a crime just as egregious as the order which preceded it. The gift of cognition disallows the philosophical subject the alibi of unthinking justification. Rebellion is a form of ungrounded romanticism, and we rebel against what is through our own hubris. This is the nature of the metaphysical rebellion described by Camus. It is metaphysical because it disputes the ends of man and of creation. The dogmatist rejects creation in its infinitude and segregates an area where they can be coronated. The iconoclast is also a monarch, but only in the ruins of what they have wrought. The metaphysical rebel attacks a sheltered world to make it whole. He confronts the injustice at large in the world with his own principles of justice. Dogmatism is a protest against not only the weak condition of man, physically and intellectually, but against the mysterious nature of metaphysical creation. Dogmatism unifies us under a flag of philosophical order, which rejects continued suspension of judgment in service of any oncoming metaphysical miracle. The dogmatist has no patience for the final act. It is not sufficient to live. There must be a destiny which does not have to wait on death. The intoxication of revolutionary fervour often turns us against the nature of reality itself. The imagination of the human intellect and the craving of desire often shifts from the original impetus for liberation to the arrogance of domination. When metaphysical opinion is asserted, a priori of the truth being known, this belief drags its adherents towards its logical precipice. Quote, The slave starts by begging for justice and ends up wanting to wear a crown. He too wants to dominate. End quote. Universal and insatiable human appetite for the next thing hijacks ideals with ambition and perverts any hope at the originally imagined justice. Once the primacy of one dogmatic view has been instituted, the world is no longer enough, as it happens to be in the wrong shape. Inevitably, dogmatic agents begin their work to form the disagreeable nature of reality into the perfect sphere which will accommodate their dream. Metaphysical silence confirms the suspicion that humanity must adorn reality in its own image. Quote, "The unity of the world, which was not achieved with God, will nevertheless be attempted without him." End quote. The failure to perfect with imperfect hands is eventually blamed on unfortunates and undesirables. Rebellion takes its most violent form in an internal purge. It is not good enough to be in our own image any longer, for the dogmatic requires a higher ideal to perpetuate its industry. Massacres justified by philanthropy, or the taste for the superhuman, cripple judgment. The imperfection of man is its burden. The propensity to see through dogmatic eyes critiques the face and finds bones misshaped and skin mismarked. This runs contra to the very iconoclastic imperfection of the intellectual imagination. All dogmatisms project this unattainable universalism. Nothing is more terrifying than the beautiful creativity of human cruelty. Quote, "Man is the only creature who refuses to be what he is." End quote. The meta question is total freedom, an unbounded and unending intellectual space. We await our metaphysical miracle in the knowledge that we might one day be castigated, retributed, or simply silenced. In this respect, iconoclasm is simply an honest philosophizing aimed at the truth that we can know. The iconoclast is the affirmed subject of philosophical reality, a reality of theoretical total freedom, which opens us up to the endless suspensions and relativism, but also grants us the opportunity to follow the truth as it is revealed to us. The dogmatist revolts against this unfettered freedom. The dogmatist is the affirmed subject of human reality. History may perhaps have an end, but our task is not to terminate it, but to create it, in the image of what we henceforth know to be true. History can be made creatively from nothing more than the will of cognition. The archaeological facts be damned. Asserting a new order to rebuke those who seem themselves as undeserving of control by law. Quote, "Rebellion is in no way the demand for total freedom. On the contrary, rebellion puts total freedom up for trial." End quote. The very notion of law, legal, moral, or natural, implies a hard foundation, the absolute barrier which humanity is urged to discover or construct. Completely unchained freedom doesn't allow for the possibility of rebellion, for there is nothing against which to rebel. The guide rail of the law provides both the distributed judgments of common life along with the continuous opportunity to rebel, shall those guide rails become chains. Quote, "Freedom only exists in a world where what is possible is defined at the same time as what is not possible." End quote. The ideal presented in all dogmatic assertions implies the anti-ideal, something to be feared and avoided. In a state of total freedom, where no ideal or anti-ideal is presented as self-evident dogmatic foundation, then all that remains is either the machinations of fate or the appetites of the human animal. Camus calls this the appalling freedom of the blind. Entropy and extropy. In a similar fashion to the earlier chapter on Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty, I want to explore the relation of the mental modes of the iconoclast and the dogmatist in relation to the general phenomena of entropy and extropy. Entropy, being the general tendency over time for diffusion towards chaos, is physically analogous to the intellectual effects of iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, and by extension the meta-question, acts as a dismantling force on cognitive tradition and presupposition. Over time, the destructive forces of honest philosophy contradict dogmatic sub-questions. causing them to grow increasingly untenable. On the other hand, dogmatism orders and collects the products of cognitive production into internally coherent inquiries. This can give them a utility not inherently available to iconoclastic thinking, as the notion of measurable utility is only tenable through the axioms of a measuring fitness function. Dogmatic extropy provides the shelter which allows the compromised human subject to deal effectively with the overwhelming intellectual landscape. This comes with the caveat that these sub-questions grow stagnant over time and calcify into brittle and outmoded structures of cognitive inquiry. Both modes of cognitive activity have their benefits and drawbacks. Iconoclasm is a philosophically honest inquiry, with the understanding that this unpresupposed intellect can never truly create, lest it become dogmatic, but merely destroy when employed from the human context. Dogmatism, on the other hand, has the capability to be a productive agent of intellectual inquiry and collaborate with those who accept the same or similar family of presuppositions. However, through the requirements of intellectual foundations, the dogmatist establishes a cognitive boundary to their logic. This shuts them off from the truth of the wider meta-question and institutes a myopia within their particular sub-question. The dogmatist is given an implement by virtue of their presuppositions, but unfortunately tackles all intellectual problems with the same tool. This extropic inevitability of dogmatic thinking is particularly apparent in the empirical sub-questions. The universalism of which denies the difference in its literal and figurative atomization. It was universal like a cry, now it is universal like science. Yesterday it was put on trial, today it is the law. This is exactly the nature of dogmatical revolution. To take crime and make it ubiquitous enough to homogenize itself into the new law. This is the way in which the dogmatist is also able to utilize the products of philosophy. The dogmatist takes the open-mindedness of the meta-question and shapes it into a closed ideal. Dogmatic thought uses philosophy as its alibi, which can be used for anything. The vulgarity of the judging dogmatist is a necessity to match the vulgarity of the fallible human carbon unit, taking the crimes of mankind and transforming murderers into judges. Judgmental philosophy, in the form of vulgar dogmatism, has its way to dominate those with lack of character. This is made apparent by the simplistic strains of religion, science, and ideology. This control, employed through the subconscious cry for existential comforters, has dominion for the majority of the human race, who take refuge in doctrine, and cannot be saved by virtue of their invitality. The doctrine of the herd, the adoration of extreme overcorrecting extropy. The fallout of oppressive extropy in the form of education in Occidental culture has instantiated reason as supreme and found its manifestations in an ontology of the busybody. Universal mental capacity for such a reason across the human population is a myth which the various Occidental subcultures must tell themselves to reassure of the imagined eschatology of egalitarian and universal transcendence, which has its roots in emancipatory Protestantism, and develop new idols for the homogenizing extropy of contemporary politics. The pretense that there is no reason to be unreasonable is itself a sort of intellectual colonialism which begs for rebellion. An excess of extropy makes crime reasonable. As long as the dogmatist makes the laws, they can commit no crime. There is no price too dear for the dogmatic project. There is no bureaucracy stultifying enough to justify halting its growth. There is no era bloody enough to suggest we aren't right on the cusp of the end of all histories. It is in this hubris the reasonable emerges to castigate vitality. Quote, "The language particular to totalitarianism doctrines is always scholastic or administrative language." End quote. Over time, the internally consistent logic of the dogmatic administration inevitably begins to contradict the entropy of reality. The minutiae of internal affairs, such as using the correct color paper for a particular form, becomes of greater importance than the existential gaps of fundamental meaning. The dogmatic I is meticulous in the triviality of health and safety assessment procedures, only to overlook the fact that the entire building is about to collapse. The myopia of the dogmatist makes cognitive activity blind to those axioms which are not presupposed. Quote, "The society based on productive is only productive, not creative." End quote. Society based on science is only scientific, not creative. The society based on religion is only religious, not creative. The society based on finance is only financial, not creative. The society based on philosophy is only philosophical, not creative. Each instantiation of such dogmatic value forms a priesthood in the image of its base principle. This encourages structures of epistemological deference. The empirical sub-questions are an evident contemporary example. Quote, "A society whose scientists would be priests, where absolute obedience of action, of thought, and of feeling would be given to the high priest who would reign over everything." End quote. The intellectual totalitarianism of dogmatism not only implies metaphysical absolutism of the pre-physical, but also extends itself forward into observable reality. Each of the instantiations of dogmatism implying its own eschatology, an anticipation of the end, whether this be a beyond empty void or eternal retribution in judgment. These material and immaterial projections of universal history justify the new faith, dragging the subjects of the sub-question in collective lockstep. The justification being that the material or immaterial utopia is not only inevitable, but just around the corner. Quote, "The idea of progress is substituted for the divine will. The total mass of the human race, by alleviating stages of calm and agitation, of good and evil, always marches, though with dragging footsteps, towards greater and greater perfection." End quote. The totalizing thought of the dogmatist forgets its unbreakable connection to the limited and fallible human subject, who has a naturally evolved urge to see things in a heuristically universal fashion. In this regard, dogmatic thought is arguably a result of energy conservation strategies. The extravagant apparatus of the sub-questions neglects the reason for their continuing propagation through the intoxication of intellectual myopia. It is not by metaphysical fault that this is the case, for it could be the case that any of the dogmatic metaphysical opinions are the truth of the metaphysical miracle. Adherents to dogmatic cognition have no access to such truth and potentially would not be able to decipher or meaningfully utilize such a truth if it were to present itself. This is the predicament which gives us the maxim against normalizing all thought as dogmatic. Quote, "No matter how meticulous the system, it cannot foresee every eventuality." End quote. It is this blind form of dogmatism described which explains the intoxicating effect the sub-question can have. As stated previously, this applies equally to ideology, religion, and empiricism. Ideology institutes a dogmatism of community, a moral panic, where the culpability is sacrificed to the in-group. Religion provides a mechanism of judgment, where matters of eternity drown the conscience of the present. Empiricism asserts abstract matter and perfect laws as the objective. This strips reality of any eschatology, making the only possible goal the categorization of the material. Quote, "To this extent, the apocalypse becomes an absolute value in which everything is confounded: love, death, conscience, and culpability." End quote. The entropy of the dogmatist is a very human endeavor against the continuous entropy of all things. Like all human ventures, the entropy of the universe will always win in the end, sometimes with the assistance of rival sub-questions or iconoclastic terrorism. Intellectual movements rise and fall like geographical empires. Entropy makes certain that cognitive fashion remains nomadic.